If you're not fired up to worship after that amazing praise session, I think you're dead. So thank you so much to Joycelyn and the rest of the team. That was incredible. I'm just going to say a quick additional prayer, and then we'll dive into this, okay? Father in heaven, I want to thank you for the amazing worship that we've been able to experience this morning already. Thank you for opening our hearts to your word. Be with me as I share some thoughts that you've pointed out to me from the Bible. Help it to reach each of us with something that will draw us closer to you. Amen. So my name is Tyler Pender. I'm married to Melissa Pender. We've been attending here off and on with training effectively since 2017. And the first thing I think we have to address is the fact that I'm here able to give the sermon. For those of you who may know, we've been threatening to leave for quite some time. My wife and I we graduated from Loma Linda. We completed some of our training here at the University of Utah, and we've been working to be missionaries in Malawi, which is a country in Africa, right above South Africa. And we've been mired in visa purgatory for quite some time. So we are still in Utah, believe it or not. I'm sorry if I'm talking too loud. I'm blowing your mics out. I don't know how to fix that. So, we've been blessed to continue to be here in Utah for a bit. We originally were supposed to be gone back in like October or November, so we're very happy to be here. But it did provide a personal object lesson for the sermon topic of waiting on the Lord, since we've been doing a lot of waiting lately. Ron told me I had just under 2 hours. I've been able to trim it down to about an hour and a half, so we should be good, okay? So briefly about what we've been waiting on, since that sparked a lot of this, kind of my thought for this sermon. We first visited the country of Malawi back in the summer of 2022. We met with Dr. Hart at that time. We formalized the plan to go over there and work as faculty at the hospital there. And then since that time, it's just been kind of one thing after another. So getting permission to start the process, details with the process, a lot of paperwork, managing a couple different organizations, the Adventist Church, the United States government, the Malawian government. And so we're still waiting on that last step. I was able to go over there in the fall, in October to November, and work for a month. And it was an incredibly positive experience. I was able to work with a lot of their staff that they have there, a lot of the ministries and missions they've been able to do, see the potential for the site. Incredible investments have been put into it by the World Church, by Loma Linda, and by donors from around the United States as well. Of course, a lot of connection there with the different people that come through especially the Loma Linda system, including some people that have from this church. And so it definitely is. Sorry, I'm going to keep talking this level, guys. So whatever's going on, you're going to have to kill something. So it did make me more excited to go back, but it definitely also heightened the feeling that we were kind of in this waiting period until we could do that. And so for us, we've been thinking a lot about, you go through these ups and downs in the waiting process. The ups are certainly there, such as the fact that I got to meet my nephew Arthur, who's down here in the front. Originally we thought maybe I would come back, do a quick trip when he was born, because we were going to be gone for months by the time he was born. And of course now he's like a toddler and growing rapidly. And so clearly the time frame has shifted quite a bit. And so there's some ups, being able to be with our friends and family in Utah. But there's also these moments where it's this feeling of uncertainty, right? We can't make long-term plans. We're perpetually waiting for a visa to come through, so do we book trips? Do we book fun things? Do we book work? Not so fun, all these different things just kind of all play into it. And I think anytime that there's a religious component for our very minor experience, overall we're super happy with everything, it's more of the uncertainty, but leading into more serious topics, I think time that we're waiting in something that we believe to be either a moral issue or a religious issue, it prompts a different set of questions than just waiting on other things, perhaps professional or commercial or academic, because of this idea, the faith component, right? We can't divorce it from that. Waiting for anyone who is a Seventh-day Adventist here, and waiting is a central part of our identity. For anyone who's not, it's a frequent part of. It's a lot of different religions' identities, right? Any Protestant-based religions have a waiting component. And a lot of other even Christian religions have a waiting component for some divine entity or a return of some figure or the return of a prophet. And so this is a common theme throughout different worldviews, not just Seventh-day Adventists, and certainly not just Protestant America. And this point can be frequently mocked by different people in the world. There's whether that's pop culture references to getting rescued by Sky Jesus or Sky Daddy, or the famous play Waiting for Godot, which mocked some of these ideas of waiting for a figure that would never come. And so there's a lot of things that are unique and challenging about. Sorry guys, do you want me to switch to a different mic? It's like, is it killing you guys or is it just me? If it's just me, I can try to persevere, but it's quite notable. All right, sounds good. Which one? Okay. I never suffer in silence. It's one of my character strengths. Is this one on? All right. Is it still? All right. Can everyone hear me? All right, I can hear myself now. I'm much happier. Thanks. It was just like the echo from behind me. I'm just not an experienced preacher, so I'm just not used to the back. I was like, I feel like I was shouting in my own ears. This is much better. Thanks, Micah. And so there's this element that's different about religious component, right, of waiting. We start to ask a different set of questions. Do we feel personally betrayed? Do we feel like God is letting us down? Do we feel offended? Is our pride hurt? Are we insecure? Maybe we didn't understand what God's plan was. Maybe we're too sinful. Maybe God's judging us. Maybe the plan's right, but we're not right. And then you can zoom all the way out to huge existential questions, like maybe God doesn't exist, right? Maybe this whole thing is, you can really start to spiral in some of these dark nights of the soul. And so whether it's our personal, insecurities with these things, whether it's the religious side, I think waiting is certainly challenging for me. And the closer it is to any type of religious question, it's harder, even harder, I feel like, for me. And so today my goal was to look through some examples from the Bible and people of faith and see what we could learn from some of these experiences from others. And as we're going through some of these examples, I'm going to start with perhaps a few examples of how not to wait, and then hopefully end on a slightly more positive note. And let's think about maybe what feelings these biblical characters could have been feeling, some of the reasons they actually did, as well as some of the feelings that perhaps we would resonate with, because we're all different, right? Everyone has a different set of things that they bring to these questions. And so we can kind of think, maybe I could identify with that part of that story. So the first one is we're going to go back to 1 Samuel. So I have a lot of Bible verses today. So if you're on your Bible or your phones, feel free to flip along. So this is in 1 Samuel chapter 13. So the background is that the Philistines have been all stirred up, okay? Saul is the first king of Israel, which themselves that's a whole separate sermon, right, about how Saul became the first king. But he gets in a tight spot, and he wants God's approval, and he's been instructed to wait. And so in verse 1, I'm going to read a few verses here. 1 Samuel 13, verses 1 through 2. So Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, Saul chose him 3,000 men of Israel, whereas 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash and in Mount Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin. And the rest of the people he sent every man to his tent. So Saul's been king for a few years. He's stripped his standing army down to 3,000. And then in verse 3, it says, Jonathan smote the garrison of the Philistines that were in Geba, and the Philistines heard of it. So Saul blew the trumpet throughout all the land, saying, let the Hebrews hear. And all Israel heard say that Saul had smitten a garrison of the Philistines, and that Israel also had an abomination with the Philistines. And the people were called together after Saul went to Gilgal. So Jonathan, ever the courageous crown prince, strikes the enemy at one of their garrisons and sets off a firestorm. So notice the press release here in verse 4, of course, has to say that Saul struck the garrison. This is classic Saul, right? The guy cannot tolerate anyone else doing things, even though this is arguably not the best decision. And this is the same issue that rears its head with David, this insecurity that Saul carries. And it's going to play a part in this story as well, unfortunately. It's a recurring issue. And it continues in verse 5. And the Philistines gathered themselves together to fight with Israel, 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and people as the sand which is on the seashore in multitude. And they came up and pitched in Michmash, eastward from Beth Haven. When the men of Israel saw that they were in a strait, for the people were distressed, then the people did hide themselves in caves and in thickets and in rocks and in high places and in pits. And some of the Hebrews went over Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. As for Saul, he was yet in Gilgal, and all the people followed him, trembling. So if we read these verses, what's the mood in camp? Not good. The vibes are off. The center cannot hold. Whatever metaphor you want to use, this verse emphasizes that just the horses and chariots alone that the Philistines have, their armored divisions, are way more than any force possible that the Israelites are able to summon. So this is, from an objective standpoint, this would be a hopeless situation. Now, previously, Samuel, the prophet, who is at this time in Israel's history and the Bible, is how God speaks to his people, right? So this is the voice that God is speaking through to Saul, the first king. And he instructed Saul to wait for him in this certain location, and then they were going to offer sacrifices. So it continues in verse 8. And he, Saul, tarried 7 days, which is how long Samuel had told him to wait, according to the set time that Samuel had appointed. But Samuel came not to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. So Saul sees that, on the day that Samuel has appointed, he is not there yet. And he sees that his army is starting to scatter even further. So Saul says, "Bring hither a burnt offering to me and peace offerings." And he offered the burnt offering. And immediately, who shows up? Samuel. So it came to pass, as soon as he had made an end of offering the burnt offering, Samuel came. Saul goes out to meet him. Samuel says, "What hast thou done?" And then Saul starts into the excuse train, right? "Well, I saw that the people were scattered from me, and thou camest not within the days appointed, and the Philistines gathered themselves together at Michmash. Therefore I said, the Philistines will come down now upon me to Gilgal, and I have not made supplication unto the Lord. I forced myself, therefore, and offered a burnt offering." Samuel says to Saul, "Thou hast done foolishly. Thou hast not kept the commandment of the Lord thy God, which he commanded thee. For now would the Lord have established thy kingdom upon Israel forever." And then Samuel goes on to describe how this represents a break between God and the house of Saul. And so, at first glance, I sometimes really dislike this story because it seems like such a kind of almost a trivial misunderstanding of schedules and logistics. But for Saul as the king to directly ignore a command from God because of all these reasons, he's scared, right? The people don't like me anymore. There's so many of them. Who's going to fight them? I mean, the whole thing is hopeless already, right? There's no way that if by offering a burnt offering, the remaining 2,000 troops are going to be able to beat this massive army. And so the one thing that Saul needed to do was wait, even in the face of overwhelming discomfort, right? This was the waiting 7 days while your enemies were building a massive army and waiting for Samuel. It just seemed irresistibly bad for Saul. But that's exactly what God needed him to do to be able to work the victory that he had commanded and promised. What did Saul, Saul had done some things right here. He'd set up to worship. He had instructions from Samuel. Saul certainly argued that he had good intentions, right? But he feared for himself over everything else. And so even though his impatience looked like worship, without God's blessing, it was not worship to God. And acts of worship, but not to God, paints a concerning alternative, heresy at best. So let's keep this theme in mind as we move through a couple more of these examples, that moving forward without God is not worship. The next example is perhaps the example. Everyone, if I gave you this sermon title and said, "Hey, I'm going to pick a few biblical examples, what do you guys think?" The large percentage would guess this one. So we're going to talk about the Israelites waiting for Moses. So background story. So if you are in a quarterly based lesson class, we're going to read a section from Psalms 105 that you guys talked about last week. And if you're in a non-quarterly based class, we talked about Exodus last week, so it's perfect. So the Israelites are camped out by Mount Sinai. From Psalms 105, verses 36 through 43. This is a poetic description of what God has been doing for the Israelites. He says, "He smote all the firstborn in their land," that's the Egyptians, "the chief of all their strength. He brought them," the Israelites, "out with silver and gold. There was not one feeble person among their tribes. Egypt was glad when they departed, for the fear of them fell upon them.
He spread a cloud for a covering and fire to give light in the night. The people asked, and he brought quails, and he satisfied them with the bread of heaven, which is manna. He opened the rock, and the waters gushed out. They ran in the dry places like a river. For he remembered his holy promise and Abraham his servant. And he brought forth his people with joy and his chosen with gladness. So this is an all-encompassing description of God's care for his people, right? This is every aspect of it. He got rid of their enemies. He crippled the nation. They got all their wealth. The Red Sea, devastating military damage to the Egyptians. He's providing bread. They wanted some meat, so he provided that. They wanted water. They need water, so he provided that. And he's brought them to Mount Sinai. So, every physical need has been taken care of. At Sinai, if we bounce over to Exodus 19, verse 16, and it says, then God shows up in a spiritual way. He says, and it came to pass on the third day, something got a lot better. Strong work. And it came to pass on the third day in the morning that there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud upon the mount, and the voice of the trumpet exceedingly loud, so that all the people that were in the camp trembled. So you have to step back and ask yourself, was this subtle? No, it was not. So this is a huge, the nature itself is demonstrating God's presence. Then God appears, within the cloud on the mount in Exodus 20. He goes through the 10 Commandments. If we start in Exodus 20, we're not going to read all of them because that's not the point of this one, but verses 1 through 6, God starts to speak. And the first thing that he talks about says, I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God. And then it goes on to describe both his judgment side as well as his merciful side. So this is the first thing that God is emphasizing as part of the law that he's going to share with his people. If you had to condense this down to another phrase that we commonly use, this is basically the whole point of avoiding idols, right? Avoiding idolatry. And we're going to talk a lot more about that in just a second. So the Israelites agree to follow all of this, right? They go through it, they get the full law, they pledge, they promise, we will do all of these things and our children. And then Exodus 24, so if you're following along, skip ahead a few chapters, Exodus 24, 15 through 18. And Moses goes up into the mount, and a cloud covers the mount. And the glory of the Lord abode upon Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. And the seventh day he called unto Moses out of the midst of the cloud, and the sight of the glory of the Lord was like devouring fire on the top of the mount in the eyes of the children of Israel. And Moses went into the midst of the cloud and gat him up into the mount, and Moses was in the mount 40 days and 40 nights. So even though Moses has left the camp, right, they can still see what's going on, right? There's a huge cloud of fire over the top of this mountain. Again, not a subtle thing. And so what is Moses learning about when he's in the mountain this time? Remember, this isn't the first time where God's reading the law. Moses is learning about the sanctuary, right? So, and the tabernacle and the sanctuary is a component of that. And so God is going through this blow-by-blow description of what that how they will do it, some of the reasons that it means. And of course, this is a metaphor for basically everything about, what we currently believe even to this day, right? I understand last week I wasn't here, but I understand you guys talked about the 2300-day prophecy, right? All of these things connect into that. And so there's a strong parallel between Moses, who's a type of Christ here, being removed, right? And he's involved with this sanctuary message. The people are in their literal Day of Atonement. To us, in the present time, right, with our understanding that our high priest is in the holiest of holies since 1844, and we are in the figurative Day of Atonement, right? And so there's, we have to be careful here not to throw too many stones at the Israelites because we're in the exact same situation, and I'm not convinced I would do any better. So the people handle this very poorly, of course. And so in 32 verse 1, and when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down out of the mount, the people gathered themselves together unto Aaron and said unto him, Up, make us gods, which shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we wot not what has become of him. We don't know what's happened to this guy. He's been gone 40 days. He's probably dead. Forgetting the fact that literally God is right here. So if Moses is dead, God's still there. But they said they're out, right? He's gone. We need to go. We got to go back to slavery probably or something. So Aaron's response is less than ideal. Instead of saying literally anything, he just says, well, break off the golden earrings, which are in the ears of your wives, of your sons, and your daughters, and bring them unto me. And all the people brake off the golden earrings which were in their ears, and brought them unto Aaron. And he received them at their hand, and fashioned it with a graving tool, and then made it into a molten calf. And they said, these be thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. So in 40 days, we go from, we're totally going to follow everything, to we've invented a new creature, and this is what brought us out of the land of Egypt. And so obviously it's the story almost, it's so easy for us to observe how absurd this phenomenon was. So, despite clear instructions from God, remember, during these 40 days, this is, I'm not as biblically smart as some people, so I don't have all the numbers in my head. People will estimate how many people this group was, but the estimates are quite large, right? This is a huge group. So during these 40 days, I'm presuming, since they're not all dead, that the manna is still falling every morning, that the water is still flowing. This group has to be being sustained by literal miracles, right? And there's fire on the mountain, and yet they're ready to move on. And when we study so one of my side hobbies is, I love doing certain sports that sometimes veer towards the slightly more dangerous, and as kind of a morbid fascination out of that, studying how disasters work when human decision making is present. There's overlaps between almost any field, whether that's aviation, whether that's medicine, whether that's the military, and for recreationally, mountaineering, backcountry skiing. Usually, anytime that humans end up with a terrible outcome, if you step it back, there's a lot of the same phenomenon that go into the decision-making process. Another thing that happens when things work out poorly, right? If you go into a bad thing has happened, we're going to do this analysis. So if somebody, if there's a backcountry avalanche accident, for example, and there's a report that's always gets written by the Utah Avalanche Center, and all of us flock to it, not for any good reason, right? We want to figure out what they did, right? Because if we can figure out what they did wrong, then we can make it this super obvious paradigm, right? Well, this group did this. Obviously, I would never do that. And so thus, I am at no risk to do that, right? And the Israelites, I feel like, at least for me, it's very easy to pile on them in this story, right? And be like, how could you guys have done this? And I think a big part of that is mentally, it's easy to shift it to the idea of idolatry being limited to this comical calf that they've created, right? Even though they have the God of heaven in a cloud format nearby. And it's easy to say, this molten creature is the problem. And then since most of us are from, Western-based societies, that form of idol worship is not really meshed into our culture. So we can put layers between us and this decision. We can say, well, idolatry is that. My culture doesn't even do that. My religion certainly doesn't do that. So I'm 3 degrees separated from any chance that I will fall into idolatry. And so then you can blow past the first 2 commandments, basically, and you're already, 20% through, And so and it's so easy to do that, right? And you can't ignore the fact that we do that in literally everything else. So we definitely do it in religion too, right? Whereas while it's easy to point this out to them, but if you think about what do we have that the Israelites don't have? For starters, we have their story. Then we have the New Testament where it talks about Jesus. And then we have the epistles and all the different letters. And then we have Revelation. So, I think we best be careful before we criticize the Israelites especially when we consider that idolatry, the broader meaning of that is not an object. It's anything that we make, right? Anything that we do. And in the context of waiting, which is the discussion point for this sermon, if we move ahead without God, we are creating, if it's not God and we created it, that's idolatry by definition, right? We're moving something else, our plans, our initiative, our vision for how this should go over God. We're doing the exact same thing the Israelites are doing. And we don't have the excuse that they're like trapped out in the desert, right? At least they have that excuse. We don't have that. And so I think this story seems simple on the surface, but it's actually very convicting the more I studied it. Moving slightly to we're going to work our way more positive, okay? I can't end on the Israelites. So third example, we're going to bounce over and talk about Elijah. So Elijah was a prophet that was, one of the greatest prophets ever, right? He was a part of these epic stories in the Bible, and the verses we're going to look at here occur right after one of God's major victories, where God, defeats the prophets of Baal. It gets like almost dangerously close to being a coup. There's this a huge victory for God's cause, and of course, coming off that emotional high, boom, the down is just as strong, and Elijah panics. He thinks he's going to get killed. He loses track of all these principles we're trying to establish about how to wait on the Lord, runs out in the desert. Eventually, he finally stops, right? He makes his way to the mountain of the Lord, and he finally stops and waits. And so then God provides for him along the way, and then comes and tells him to do something. So in 1 Kings 19, 11 through 13, he said, "Go forth," and this is God talking, "Go forth and stand upon the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains," even stronger than the wind today, okay? "And brake in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. And it was so, when Elijah heard it, that he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood in the entering in of the cave. And behold, there came a voice unto him and said, What doest thou here, Elijah?" So when we stop running, when we stop creating our version of events, God will speak. And if you had to design God's manifestation here, God showed him wind and earthquake and fire, these powerful elements, almost like doesn't quite get there because we don't have water, but these are almost like the element, basic elements, right, throughout human history that we love to emphasize, these outpourings of nature's power. This is how we would have done it, right? This would have been how we would have shown God's presence on this mountain, but that wasn't God's plan. And this should be a real, warning to me at least, that so often what I think would be the perfect way to demonstrate God's power here is probably not what God's thinking at all. And God says that pretty explicitly if we come over to Isaiah 55, verse 8. He says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, saith the Lord." And if we wait on the Lord and trust his ways, then he will act. And the famous verse in Isaiah 40, verse 31, "But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint." So our last example from the Bible is a group of people led by their leader, right? Attitude reflects leadership. This is, the leaders are a critical part of this. So if you go to 2 Chronicles chapter 20, the beginning verses outline this dire situation that this is, I believe, actually the kingdom of Judah. This is after the split. If I'm wrong, somebody can tell me later, but I believe this is after the split of Israel, and the 10 and the 2 have split, and so this is Jehoshaphat, who I believe is the king of Judah. And he is being faced by this overwhelming army that's coming at him of Moab, Ammon, and the Ammonites, the classic enemies of Israel during this time frame. They form an alliance, they come at them, and there's the same descriptions that you kind of recognize the pattern of the descriptions of the army that the Philistines had gathered to face Saul. But the response is completely different. As we go through this, let's just look at how different this is. So first, Jehoshaphat gets together the people, right? This is basic leadership. I mean, this doesn't even have to be religious. Like, assemble the people together, right? These are the fundamentals of how to lead a group of people. And then, as the king who believes in God, he brings in this religious component, and they're going to have a prayer meeting, right? They need a revival, and he knows it. And he prays this incredible prayer, and he closes in 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 12. And he says, O our God, will thou not judge them? For we have no might against this great company that cometh against us, neither know we what to do, but our eyes are upon thee. So to me, like, reading this, even when I was preparing this sermon, helped to alleviate, at long last, some of my distaste for the story of Saul and Samuel, because that story always just seems so almost petty, if you just look at some of those details. But if you look at Jehoshaphat, this is what God needed from his leaders. If you're in a position of leadership, if you're in a position of trust and being an ambassador, which, as like our music group sang about, right? If that's all of us, right? We all believe that we have been entrusted with this position. This is how you need to respond to it. He's going to God. He's admitting that the battle is unwinnable by human metrics. Right? There's not even this is unwinnable. He's also not running away and cowering, right? Following God's footsteps doesn't mean you're a coward. It's actually the exact opposite. He admits, I don't know what to do. And then where is his focus? Our eyes are upon thee, right? We're waiting on you. All eyes are on you. And so the contrast to him and Saul is night and day. So then a prophet responds with a very different message than the one that Samuel, unfortunately, was entrusted to respond with. In verse 15 and 17, and the prophet says, Hearken ye, all Judah, and ye inhabitants of Jerusalem, and thou, King Jehoshaphat. Thus saith the Lord unto you, Be not afraid nor dismayed by reason of this great multitude, for the battle is not yours, but God's. Then comes a brilliant scouting report. Tomorrow go ye down against them. Behold, they come up by the cliff of Ziz, and ye shall find them at the end of the brook before the wilderness of Jeruel. Convenient, right? Like, if you work with God, he literally knows everything, right? So there's I'm a very practical person, so I just love how in the middle of this beautiful prayer and an almost allegorical speech, and then the prophet says, and here's exactly where they are, right? So Jehoshaphat then remember what he prayed about, I can't win this battle. God says, I can win this battle. He says, I don't even know what to do. And he says, well, here's exactly where they are. So then Jehoshaphat, he's good to go. So the people, the buy-in on this is incredible, right? So they believe so firmly that they are both unable to do anything and that God can do everything, that they do one of the most bizarre battle formations ever described in any form of literature. So in verse 21, and when he had consulted with the people, this is Jehoshaphat, again, good leadership skill, right? Consults back with the people. He appoints singers unto the Lord, that they should praise the beauty of holiness as they went out before the army, and to say, Praise the Lord, for his mercy endureth forever. So we have a lot of our musical groups here today, so in event of a combat situation, this is the equivalent of sending you guys out in front while the armored divisions come behind. But they don't mean this in a trivial way, right? This is not delusional. This is evidence of their faith that God will win this battle. And does he ever? I mean, I feel like this one gets buried a little bit by the angel at the gates with Sennacherib, where the angel just completely wipes out the whole other group. But this battle is just as impressive. So as the choir goes forth, the army follows behind. God sends chaos into the ranks of the other alliance. They turn on each other, and by the time the choir crests the hill with the banners behind, everyone's dead. They've completely wiped themselves out. They take 3 or 4 days to carry all the spoil back. They have a huge religious festival. And then mercifully, because I need some wins when you're reading through Chronicles, it documents that Jehoshaphat stayed true to God his whole life. And it talks about, it's one of the coolest stories in the whole Bible. And the fact is, it wouldn't have happened if Jehoshaphat hadn't been willing to stop and wait for God's instructions and for his deliverance instead of coming up with his own idea. We don't have to fight these battles. Waiting, the only thing harder than waiting is fighting the battles that we don't need to fight. Shane and Shane, a Christian group, penned these lyrics. They said, "There's mercy in the waiting, manna for today, and when it's gone, I know you're not. You are my hope and stay. When the sea is raging, your spirit is my help. He'll fix my eyes on Jesus Christ, and I'll say that it is well. I'm fighting a battle that you've already won. No matter what comes my way, I will overcome. I don't know what you're doing, but I know what you've done. We will be with you again. You're my Savior, my defense. No more fear in life or death. I know how this story ends." I thought those lyrics were kind of matched perfectly this description of, even mentioned the manna. So in conclusion, the best way to wait on the Lord, for the Lord, is to wait with the Lord. The waiting is difficult. We can't even wait under our own power. Right? That's the really humbling part. In Hebrews 11, verse 1, it says, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." You're waiting on things that we haven't seen. And that takes faith, and that can only come from God as well, which is why it can't be enough to wait we can't just wait for him to be there. We have to have him with us even while we're waiting for these things. A failure to wait for God to act is a lost chance to worship. A failure to wait for God to act means we are acting, and is a form of idolatry. As we wait individually, as a church, as a world, may we focus not on what we can do, but what God has done, is doing, and will do. His ways are not our ways. We may not recognize his methods. It probably wouldn't be how we would have even done it, but we don't have to carry that burden. We must simply trust in him for the faith and guidance to wait with the Lord. Melissa and Miriam are going to play a song of reflection, and while they're playing, let each of us consider what God may be calling us individually in our lives, in our families, in our church, to wait on with him.